Oh, it's for Fortnite. I don't know if I have Unreal Engine installed. I might. I don't know.
We're live again.
Cool. All right. Hi. Welcome back. So yeah, where we left off was right after draw calls. So kind of just going over the definition for that, and then before we get started with how to diagnose performance in your Unity game, we're going to talk about picking your target device. You should do this probably pretty early on in your project. Pick some device that will be running your game, preferably the lowest end, oldest device you're willing to support, that you're willing to put up with and deal with the pain. So for mobile, you have a bunch of choices, but two really good ones are iPad and Kindle Fire. I would say absolutely try to get on the Kindle Fire. I hear from a lot of developers that they make a lot of their money on the Amazon App Store, sometimes almost as much as their iOS counterpart. So obviously you can hit those two, iPad, Kindle Fire. Obviously the iPhone, try to find the oldest iPhone you're willing to support, which will probably end up being the oldest iPhone that is currently on the latest iOS. So if you can get a hold of one of those. And then Kindle Fire has got like an older Android version, but it's still a pretty capable machine. The reason they're so popular is parents buy them for their kids because they go on sale for really cheap, like talking like $25 for like a pretty decent tablet that can run 3D games. So of course you're going to buy one for your kids and hand it to them, and you're going to have a good time. And then if you're targeting PC, ask grandma to borrow her old e-machine, or buy a cheap computer with no graphics card. So generally those are two good options. You should try to hit the lowest end computer you can. Don't use your own computer, your dev computer, as the target device, because your computer will always run it better than the general populace. So we're going to get into some Unity specific stuff. How to debug performance in your Unity game. So Unity has a bunch of built-in tools, and I'll be going over a good chunk of them tonight. First, most important, is the profiler. So this is a tool built into Unity. It's just an editor tool. You go in the editor, you go to Window, Analysis in 2018.2. It's just laid there as Profiler in older versions, but Window, Analysis, Profiler, you'll see this window. If you hit the play button in your game, this bar will start to fill up with a bunch of junk that you can't really understand too well. When I first saw it, I didn't know what it was, but it's actually pretty simple. So going from left to right, all of these are timelines. So this is any point from here on. This is the current point in time, and then anything to the left of it is in the past. So if I went back this far, maybe this is 1 second, right? So if I were to click at any point on here, this would kind of almost like a video editor or something, put the current point in your kind of Explorer on that point in time, and you can kind of explore down here what the processor and graphics card were thinking when at that point in time, and how long it took for both of those to finish rendering that frame. Every point in this timeline is a frame. We've got, so on the x-axis left to right, that's time, and then on the y-axis up and down, that's how these little mountains are how long it took for that frame to render. So the higher it is, the longer it took. Pay attention to these bars right here. It might be a little hard to see because it's like a little blurry, but these bars are essentially different target frame rates. If one of these mountains gets to this point here, that means that frame was rendered in the amount of time to have a perfect 60 frames per second. If it's lower than that, if it's on this bar, that is the amount of time it would take to render 100 frames per second. If it kept doing that exact amount of time every single frame. and then lower than that. There's another bar, it's kind of hard to see, it's 200 frames per second. That changes dynamically. This whole, like the amount of bars you see changes dynamically based on what your lowest frame rate is in this span of time. So sometimes you'll see 30 frames or 20 frames or 10 frames per second. That means you're having some real bad performance issues. So right now you see 60, and then we've got a bunch of mountains. It's running higher than 60 frames per second, but vertical sync's on, it's not displaying any more than that. Ideally, you really want a flat plateau, but in the editor, sometimes there's some bounciness. And you can see right here, really closely, that frame took a little more than 16 milliseconds to run. So that means there was a lag spike right there. So, a couple other little windows you can see. I'm going to go over, actually I'm going to go over what you see in the bottom right now. So on the bottom, you see the different aspects of either your code. So this is usually code right here. So different scripts, if you can zoom into it and see, like, you'll get a description of a script and how long it took. The wider it is, the more time it took. And this is kind of almost like its own separate timeline. So 0 milliseconds, and then this took 6.5 milliseconds, and then this took some amount of time longer than that. So you can kind of see it's like a little bit of a timeline. This is a little harder to read and get some exact information from. So another view is, if you click on the timeline dropdown, you can pull up the hierarchy, which I prefer. This gives you a detailed view, almost like a spreadsheet, of how long something is taking in your game. So you'll see these are the scripts and like all the different things that are running in your game, the names of them, and then this is how long it took to run those. So there's something in here that took 6.4 milliseconds to run. And then garbage collection, which I'll go over a little later, just how much extra memory that Unity has to dispose of. You've allocated from certain functions. So there was a bit of a lag spike right here. Here's more of the profiler. So this is the rendering profiler. You can see just exactly what the graphics card is thinking in here. So ideally, this is the same thing. You want these lines to be flat in here, but you'll see when there's like graphics spikes. So the graphics card took a little long here to render, a little longer than usual. So yeah, you can get information like how many polygons and vertices are being drawn, how many draw calls, and how much memory you're using, stuff like that, or how much texture memory. This is the actual memory. This is how much RAM. This is the memory view. This is how much RAM your game is taking up. So textures and meshes tell you how much memory is showing up here, how much memory Unity's using, how much garbage you've allocated, stuff like that. This is another kind of zoomed in view of a lag spike. So you see I had a bad enough lag spike where the frame rate dropped down to 15 frames per second here, and I had to inspect why that happened. So there was an error, so it told me, so some script had an error and the error took too long to generate. If you're getting a lot of errors in your game, it can cause some really bad lag. So try to minimize the amount of errors you have, but yeah, it just took way too long for the debug log error to finish in that frame. So when you're using the profiler, don't profile your game in editor on the computer you're working on. Pull out your device, create a development build, and enable auto connect profile. I actually didn't get a screenshot, I should have. But the build settings have an option for development build, and once you enable that, there's an option for auto connect profiler. When you go into your target device and play the game, it will, as long as the editor is running on the computer that you're working on, and then you have the device in the same network, it will just automatically connect to the profiler and should just start working. and you'll start seeing runtime information. If you don't see any information coming from your device, this little spot here that says editor, you can click it, and then you can see what devices Unity can find on your network that are running your game right now. And if it shows up, then you can just click it and start profiling. So now I'm gonna be going into kind of the demo portion. So I've got about 4 demos lined up to kind of show you some common pitfalls as well as ways to kind of work yourself out of them. All of the stuff you see is available on GitHub. I have a link at the end of the presentation that you can just go and you can grab the code and open it up in Unity and take a look. But I'll be going over some of the code in a little bit. So I've got 2 portions. I've got a code portion and a graphics portion. So it's not, you just don't need to just know how to program to get performance better. You can have graphics performance issues that, hopefully I'll be able to help you figure out how to fix. So I'm gonna start with some code, bit of a nerd alert. So some of this is like just below intermediate. So you need to know a little bit of programming to get some of this stuff and get anything out of this part. Hopefully it's not too bad. So, gonna start with, so the first example I have is what is known as hitching or stuttering or micro stuttering. This is when your game it seems to be running fine, but it looks like every once in a while there's like a very minor skip, and I know some people have some issues diagnosing this. So I've got my target device here. I like to use this for development. It is the Surface Pro 3. It's got no graphics card, but it can run 3D stuff, which is great. Is everything okay with it, Alex? Like so just show up on the screen. Okay, cool.
Yeah, it says game title and yeah, there it is.
All right, so I've got a Framerate Counter in the corner, showing what's going on. I've been having some minor issues with something running in the background on this, so it may not cooperate with me on some of the demos. So I'm sorry for that tonight. That happens. But generally, so I've got a bunch of demos. Oh, the UI is messed up. Sorry about that. So starting with hitching, so I've got an example of the bad way to do things and the lag that you might see when you're working on your game. So this is just a really, it's not cooperative, there we go. This is a really simple demo of what hitching looks like. So I've got, let me show you what's going on. I've got these trees that are spawning at random intervals, and I've got this sphere, and you'll see this in almost all the demos tonight. Got this sphere, or sorry, 2 of the demos. Got this sphere that's just moving back and forth. But if you watch it, just follow it with your eyes, you'll see some very, very minor kind of jumps. It might be a little hard to see. It might actually be really hard to see on this projector. Yeah, you might have to really look for it, but just keep an eye on it, and you'll see like it. Very minor jumps. For somebody who might have a lower end computer, this may be far worse for them. So yeah, very minor hitching. So the way you would want that to run, so this is just what's going on over here. You can kind of see if I look away from it so that the graphics card isn't doing a lot of work, you can kind of see. But sometimes it drops to like 55, 58. I'll go down in a sec. Yeah, 58. So 58 again. So yeah, so that's something you really don't want to see in your game. What you really want to see is essentially this. You want it to be perfectly smooth. So this is what a perfectly smooth animation should look like for that sphere. So if you follow with your eyes, you really don't see much, if any, hitching. It might be harder to see on the stream. Sorry about that. You can download the demos. I'll post the link after this. So let me turn around really quick. It's essentially the same thing that's going on. A bunch of Christmas trees appearing and disappearing. But what's the difference between them? Functionally, they look exactly the same. It looks the same, it acts the same, everything's, but behind the scenes, there's a little bit more than meets the eye. So let me load up that demo. Let me load up the bad version really quick. So this is the scene, same exact scene. So it's spawning a bunch of trees and then destroying them. This is a pretty common thing for a lot of games to do, especially if like you do a shooter or something like that. This isn't an entirely unrealistic situation. If you've got like, 3 or 4 enemies shooting at you in a game, maybe they've got machine guns, it's creating, 40 bullets a second. That's essentially what this is doing. So what's the deal with this? So essentially what's going on, and for some of these demos I did have to fudge it a little, but generally there's nothing that's too far out of the ordinary for some of these in terms of what's going on. It's a really simple, just every couple seconds, if the time is greater than a certain time, spawn the missing amount of trees. So it's like there's a limit to, so I think I have it set to 40 trees. Yeah, 40 trees. Spawn enough trees to fill in until you get 40 of them total. And what it does is it instantiates a new tree and then continues on. This is really bad to do in the main thread, doing any form of instantiation. You'll get hitching and lag. Huh?
Can you make the text a little bigger?
Oh, yeah. Sorry, I don't know why I'm looking up there. I have it here. That better?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, cool. So yeah, it's just spawning every X amount of time, spawn, just instantiate an object at a random position. It's really bad to do in the main thread. Don't ever instantiate anything while a game is running. Let me show you what the tree looks like. Literally nothing special with this tree. It's just in the beginning, pick a random direction to move, and then after a certain amount of time, destroy it. Now, the thing with destroying, don't ever destroy anything while the game is running, if you can help it. Don't ever destroy anything while the game is running. So if you can't create and you can't destroy, sorry for the try catch. I just wanted it to work. I didn't want to have to do any null checks. Also, this is an example of some bad code. You just have a try catch just sitting around. Basically, destroy the game object, and then there's some side effect of removing it from the list of spawned trees. So super simple script, super easy to mess up. I mean, you saw how simple that scene was and how simple the code is, but how bad it's running. That hitching, really adds up if you've got, I mean, that's only 2 scripts right there. And if you've got, 30, 40, 50 scripts running in your game, you can see some lag pretty quickly. So here is the good version of it. So this is best practices. So this is, instead of instantiating trees, what it's doing, let me pause it at the beginning. So when the game starts, what it's doing is it's using object pooling. It instantiates all the trees at the beginning, and instead of destroying them and creating new ones, it just deactivates the tree. And pull up the code for the tree. So this is the clean version. Essentially, at the start of the scene, queue up a bunch of trees to spawn, create the trees. It's fine to do as much spawning or anything as you want at the beginning of your scene, but if it's while it's running, that's really bad. So spawn a bunch up, set them inactive, and then just add them to a list, and then every X amount of seconds, essentially do the same thing as the other script, except you are, instead of spawning them, you're grabbing it out of the queue and then setting active. So the difference between the major difference between the two is, pull it up. The bad one is using just a normal list of spawned ones. It's adding new trees when trees are being spawned and then removing them when they're being destroyed, cleaning up after itself. The clean version, it's using, there's some debate whether or not this is the preferred way to do it, but I'm using a queue. It's essentially like, it's a list or an array where you can grab stuff out of it that are either in queue or dequeued. So when a tree is being deactivated, it dequeues itself, or it in-queues itself, and then when it gets activated, it dequeues itself. So essentially just dequeue the tree, remove it from the queue, and now it's spawned up, set it active, and then that's it. And then when it's destroyed, it's recycled, it's put back in the queue for something else to use, it's set inactive, and then it just goes on its way. So that happens every couple seconds. What do we learn? So with this, how to fix hitching, minimize the amount of garbage being generated. So when you instantiate or destroy a game object or a component or anything in Unity, you're creating garbage, and Unity has to do work to clean that garbage. That slows down the game and it causes hitching. You want to avoid garbage collection like the plague. So yeah, if you're spawning game objects or C# objects, use object pooling and caching. So if you are experiencing some hitching and it's not related to those things, you're probably running heavy code. Look into multi-threading if you have it in you to do that. It's a tough subject, but they're trying to make it easier through Unity's new job system, and I'll talk about some of the new developments closer to the end. But yeah, that's one way to fix hitching if you're having issues. So use object pooling. There's plenty of resources, or you can use a script similar to the one I have in this project. You can feel free to download it from GitHub. But you can see kind of the performance difference between the two. So the next demo, freezing. This is kind of a different issue from hitching in that the game visibly locks up for some amount of time and you can't do anything. This target device doesn't struggle too much with that issue. Got this weird issue where the resolution isn't right when I plug that in. Try again. Cool. All right. Freezing. So this is the bad version. So we'll see the freezing in a second. There we go. Everybody see that? This one's kind of a more extreme version of hitching. There it is. So what's going on here is I'm doing something really similar, essentially just spawning a bunch of trees, but you'll see when the trees come up, it straight up freezes. Now, something I did for this was I tried not to fudge it too much. I tried to do something pretty realistic, and I tried to combine what we learned from the last demo, which is use object pooling. So I am using object pooling in this example. So that's not the issue. So let's see what this looks like with no freezing. So this is what it should look like. It just kind of happens. And if you watch the sphere, There's no visible freezing, despite having the same visible effect of a bunch of trees coming into existence. I also put another sphere over here in case anybody needs to see it there. Cool. So what's the difference between these two? So this is a pretty common thing I see in some games where when a developer's spawning objects, the objects or the script that's spawning them, and if you look, it's the same script from the hitching scene. It's the clean version. It's using object pooling. So what I see from a lot of developers is that when they spawn an object, there's generally like some side effect of like, oh, I'm gonna load an audio file or play an audio file or load some data for my for like my attack damage or something. So let me pull up. So this is the code for what's going on. So every time one of these trees comes into existence, and I'm using object pooling, so I'm using on enable, grab a cube from resources, so load a file from the hard drive, grab an audio file from the hard drive, set the audio clip to the one that I loaded from the hard drive and play that audio clip. And then when I'm destroyed, this is where I fudge this part a little bit, but essentially, destroy the cube, like unload the cube from memory, unload the clip, stop playing that audio clip, set the clip to null, and then unload all the assets. This is the part where I fudged it a little bit, but this happens at a regular rate anyway. So say you have some enemy in the game that comes out of a spawner, and the player kills the enemy, right? And there are no more enemies on the board or on the level. This will eventually happen in the background anyway. So if there are no more enemies on the level and they have a scream noise that they do, it'll unload that scream noise, and then when the enemy spawns back up, it'll reload the scream noise, which will freeze the game. So the clean way to do that, to get the exact same effect, here's the difference, is first of all, don't ever use get component while the game's running. Try not to if you can. I cache in the await function the audio source that I'm getting. It's the same audio source that I'm getting here, except for instead of doing get component, I'm offloading it to the beginning when the scene starts. Then what I'm doing is I'm caching the cube, which is just a random prefab I'm loading. Just an example of something I wanted to have. I'm caching it into a static reference. It could be on another script, it could be anywhere. But for the sake of this demo, I put it on the script, made it static, so it always exists, whether or not an object exists. And then I cache the clip. So if either of these are null when the object comes back from object pooling, make sure you load them, set the clip, play it, and then the effect that you see, it's the same exact effect. If I wasn't going to do sound for this, but there's some really annoying dripping sound that they're playing, and it's a very large file. Yeah, it's not going to play, but it's a really annoying dripping sound. And they're all playing them at the same time. So like if there's some footstep noise that some enemy's doing, and it has to load that footstep noise every single time the enemy spawns up, I mean, that's going to really freeze the game. So you can see, like, it's the same exact effect. This is why I say don't profile in the editor. You'll see hitching, despite the game is running fine. Like if I pull up the Framerate Counter, the game is running almost entirely fine. It's just the editor has all types of weird things that happen. And let me pull up the profiler, because this would be a good opportunity to go over what's happening with the profiler. So this is what the profiler looks like when you're playing. it's just kind of filling up with a bunch of information. This is way too much for someone to handle while it's running. So you just kind of click at any point. So I'm going to go to this point here because there's like a nice high peak. Click that. And then you'll see a bunch of information. To me, this looks kind of like random garbage, but you can kind of, if you zoom in, you see a bunch of stuff here happening. This is how long it took. So from, millisecond, probably like, if you highlight it like this, actually, you can see, I can't do it. Is it on me? It's not letting me do it, even though it just let me do it. Okay, but yeah, you can see how long it took, at what point it did it, so what point in the frame's timeline it did it, maybe some code that's running. So I have scripts here. You can see, let me find a script that I made. I don't think that actually shows up, but you can really get a good breakdown, or I like going in this view. So you click here, hierarchy, you see a bunch of information here. You can open it up. This is essentially vsync right here. So if you see this big thing and it's taken forever to do, that's vsync. So it's called wait for target FPS. It's basically waiting for the graphics card to let it continue. Player cleanup cache data. I think that's some, it's the FPS counter has a little bit of garbage going on. The camera render takes about a millisecond to run, so it's pretty lean. So you can scrub through this and kind of get any point in the timeline. Another thing that's really useful, I'll save it for the graphics portion. There's also another tool in the rendering profiler that I'll go over. It's called the frame debugger. It'll tell you exactly how your frame's being rendered.
So you had the audio clip as static.
Yeah.
And that was kind of saving resources. Do you know if I had all the trees with the audio sources all pointing to the same audio clip, but I set the audio clip in editor, is that going to do similar optimization where it only loads the audio clip once?
Sort of. At some point, it'll unload. It'll be garbage collected because if no object in the scene is referencing it. So that's what that's what I kind of went over with I had to fudge it a little bit, where it's like resources.unload unused assets. That kind of happens regularly in the background. I did also fudge a little bit with the resource. I actually have two versions of the same resource with different values. I wasn't gonna go show behind the curtain for that one, but they do have different load types up here, so that it causes slightly less freezing, but it's not too big of a difference. And honestly, it's something that if you don't know what to look for, you might either not notice it or set it by accident. So it's not uncommon to see weird audio settings that people just mess with, and it's just like, oh, I didn't know it did that.
Yeah.
So
if you deactivate all the trees, it's possible that their audio clip will get garbage.
Will get garbage collected. Well, if you destroy all the trees, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's pretty common for an enemy or something, like I was saying before, they have a scream sound and it's it gets unloaded or something like that. It's random that it happens. It's mostly an issue when it's the first spawn of the scene. I've had a game that I worked on. It's the first time this thing happens in the scene, somebody shoots the gun or something like that. A sound file plays, and then it freezes the game for a half a second, and it's that shouldn't happen. So that was an issue at one point. And that wasn't through resources.load. I was looking for that for a good long while, trying to figure out why that was happening. So what did we learn? How to fix freezing. You need to eliminate any situations where you're loading content while the game is playing. Try to load it at the start of your scene. Try to initialize anything you need to run your game at the start of the scene. Don't do it while people are playing your game. So cache any references. That's what I was saying about doing git component on game objects that are really small. with not a lot of components on them. It's not that big an issue, but if you've got like a player character and they've got like 10 or 12 components, or you've got some character, something in the game that has like 10 or 12 components, that a git component can take a while to do, and it can seriously slow down the game. So that's it for code. Now it's time to do some graphics optimization. So this is for any artists out there. This is some pretty good to know stuff on how to optimize 3D and 2D art to get it to run well in your game. So this one I'm just going to call choppy. This is when your frame rate gets real low for some reason, and you'll see the demo in just a moment. So this is one of the demos that this device is not cooperating with me on. I tried to turn off all of the background processes, but for some reason sometimes the good version, the clean version of the scene will run worse than the bad version. But then all of a sudden out of nowhere it smooths out and it's fine. So when we load up the good version, I might let it just sit there for like 10 or so seconds. So this is choppy or low frame rate. So why is my game running so bad? So watch the frame rate counter in the corner. So this is a pretty simple scene, right? So this is like a nice little like pixely art style scene with those Christmas trees that we know and love. A nice fence, a brick house. But watch that frame rate up in the corner. This is not a complex scene. There's nothing special going on. I didn't have to fudge this. But look at that frame rate as I get closer to the house. Like, it's dropping down to like 35. You know, if I walk through here, it gets like, it's just as bad. But then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, it smooths back up. And can everybody see the difference between 60 and the lower frame rate? Can everybody see, like right now it's running 60? Anybody not see the difference in smoothness?
It's slow.
Yeah, it's like a little choppy, right? But then if I look away from it, it's straight up 60, it's nice and smooth again. So this is the frame rate we want. This is the frame rate we don't. So there's nothing really complex going on in this scene. So let's see the same exact scene. Everything's exactly the same, and this is what I was talking about. So let's give it like 10 seconds. It's something up with this laptop, but it smooths out. You'll see it in a sec. I might have to look away. There we go. See, it's a weird thing, and I have no clue why it's doing that. So it's almost the same exact scene, right? Like, it doesn't look any different. I go through here. There's a little bit of hitching. It gets a little lower, but it gets back to normal. So what's the difference between these two scenes, right? I'm just gonna go around and look at this. I mean, it's not a super complex scene. It's just a house, some trees. This is a pretty low-end device. This is like 4 or so years old, so it doesn't have a graphics card. I can tell you that even though the difference is that cylinder is not why this game runs better, or this scene runs better. So let's inspect. So cool. Let's look at the bad performance version of the scene. So, like I said, nothing in here that's out of the ordinary. It's just a house. Nothing hidden here that's making it lag. Not doing anything special. But one thing is, each of these pieces is a separate object. So I can pull it out, do that with it. So you'll see a lot of stuff like that, like with a lot of like voxel-based games, where it's like, oh, it's like Minecraft, and it's like the game doesn't run great, despite it having really simple graphics. This is so like such a simple looking scene, it's like you wouldn't think it would lag, but just because you used simple graphics doesn't mean you're not going to get some lag. So what's going on is a bunch of things. So each of these tile types, so brick is using a separate material. If you don't know what a material is, in Unity, material is essentially what you put on a 3D object or a 2D object that contains like the shader and what's going on with the like with the texture and everything like that with your object. So I've got this brick texture on here. Oops, don't load Photoshop. I've got a pretty simple brick texture. It's 16 by 16. It's not complex. I've got I don't want to take your survey. I've got it on point filter. That doesn't cause performance issues. If anything, it might make it like slightly better. So yeah, I see a lot of people go like, oh, my game's so simple. Why does it lag so bad? Like, is it these lights? Sort of, but that's not the whole story. So what's going on is since each of these is using their own material, so we've got the fence tile, we've got a rock tile over here, grass, etc., etc. Each of those is creating their own draw calls. So to reiterate on what a draw call is, it's when the processor tells the graphics card to draw something. The more of those you have, the more that the graphics card has to work to process all those. So if you look up, a way to gauge how many draw calls or batches your scene is using is you pull up the stats window in your editor, you look in a direction, and you look at this number here, batches. You want that number to be as low as possible. So right now it's 1,836. What does that mean, right? For mobile games, so like people always say like, oh, you need this certain Polygon count for your game or anything like that. The first thing you should be focusing on is making sure that your batches and your draw calls are as low as possible. So for mobile, generally don't go any higher than 200. We're way over that. We're like astronomically higher than 200. This will not run on an iPad. It might maybe at like 10 frames per second, but it would run like total crap. So what causes draw calls? A bunch of things. So the camera will use at least one draw call to draw an object on the screen. Any of these could use up to or more than one draw call. One thing about this scene that might not seem obvious is even though this tree is, it's three colors, each of the different colors are its own material. So the leaves are its own material, the bark is its own material, and the fruit is its own material. Because it's just colors, right? Like, you can't use that much performance, but you'd be surprised. It really does. If your game is just colors, you can tear through performance easy by just creating a bunch of these materials, popping them on a bunch of objects, and being like, I'm done. This is just pixel art, but it's the same principle. It's like, these are all different materials, and they should be the same material. When you share materials across objects, they're more likely to be batched. They're more likely to be squished together and sent all at once to the graphics card, and then it just processes it as one draw call. So let's see what that looks like in this scene. So this scene, I know there was like a little bit of twitch with the windows. I had to do a little bit of work, but it's near identical to the other one. There's not too much of a difference, but watch that draw call count go from 1,800 to 32 for a near identical scene. That batch number won't vary from device to device. That batch number will mostly remain the same unless your settings are different across devices. So a couple of the big differences are the lights on the bad version of the scene had shadowing. If you want to implement shadows on your scene, that's fine, but with how many, like, limit it to like one shadow caster or two per scene, because they use a ton of performance. So this is the same amount of lights. It's 4 plus the sun. These just don't cast shadows. So that's one major difference. But I can tell you right now, we're not going to get to 1800 draw calls by turning the shadows back on. We'll get to 84 by turning the shadows back on. But we generally want to keep the shadows off. The big difference between the two scenes is that the entire scene uses 3 materials versus, what is it? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 materials. Since we're only using 3 materials, more objects are batched together so that the performance is better. So this is where I'm going to get into the frame profiler. So I'm going to set the frame right here, and I'm going to analyze what is going on with the renderer. So if you go into profiler right here, you'll see it running. You go to rendering, there's this little button here, open frame debugger. I'm going to quit out of here, and then you'll see if you pull your game window up, this will be ready and showing you some information. So what does this mean? What is this window? So this window will tell you exactly what your game is rendering at the point that you have the frame stopped at. So if I go and I click here, and then with the arrow keys start hitting down, I can scrub through everything that the graphics card is doing. So you can see, can you turn off the light on my side? Would that be too much? Yeah. Okay. Cool. All right. So you can see this is generating some kind of silhouette of the scene. This is what's called a depth mask, and it uses that for some kind of special effects on the screen. We have I have anti-aliasing on, so it's going to generate that. This is the shadow pass for your scene. So that's what the directional light sees. So this is the sun. It sees there's a little dot, that's the character. And then it's going to draw the transparent fences, it's going to draw the trees, and it's going to draw all the solid stuff. Then it's going to do another pass to get shadows and stuff. And then it's going to draw, it actually draws all of, almost all the scene in just a few passes. So this is the actual drawing the scene. You can scrub through and you can see it generate the scene and how it does it. And it's really cool to see. And it just does that in just a few, 38 times. And you can scrub back and forth using this little thing. It's like a timeline. You go back and forth. One benefit of this screen is you can see what is being rendered. So draw mesh is generally like one batch. This is one batch, and then now it's drawing this object here, which is a tree. Then it's drawing the opaque tiles, which is all the solid stuff. And it actually tells you why it can't be batched, why they can't be mashed together and sent to the graphics card. These two objects, the object before it and the object right now, have different materials. So you'll see that a lot in the bad scene, because I'm going to do this for the bad one with the 1800 draw calls. And it takes a while to look through it. You can see the effect of the lights, the point lights that I have in the scene. For every light that that the game has to draw, it's going to do another one of these batches. You know, these take some time to run. You can see it's like all the transparent tiles are drawn and then drawn again and then drawn again. They show up. Because of the amount of lights that are affecting it, it shows up 5 times. It gets rendered 5 times by these lights. If you reduce the amount of lights in your scene, that number of draw calls goes down. So let me turn the lights off completely. You'll see it drop down to 23. I'm gonna pull the frame debugger back up, and you'll see transparent tiles only shows up once now. So when before it showed up 5 times. No longer do I see it's affected by different forward lights, stuff like that. So let's see what the bad version looks like real quick. So again, while the game's running, we got 1800, almost 1800 batches. Let's get in a good spot. So what's going on here that's lagging so much? It's causing so many draw calls. You'll see that this computer runs it fine, but somebody, like, I'm not using the same computer. I'm not using my target device to edit this or to look at this. So of course it runs fine. You'll see that this list is huge now. You know, each of these tiles, gosh, look at this. So each of these tiles, this is the depth mask that's being rendered. You can see each of the tiles being built up. And you can see on the tree here, it's rendering the fruit, and it's rendering the leaves, and then it continues on, and eventually it goes back and renders the trunk, and then it just does the same thing, and each of these is being rendered. So this is really slow. This is too much for the graphics card, or for the connection between the processor and the graphics card to handle. You can scrub through and see it like get generated in slow motion. Like, that's the shadow. That's taking forever. This is some more stuff. It's just taking a real long time. So this is it generating the actual scene that the camera sees. So you can imagine that this takes a real long time. For such a simple scene, you know, with not a whole lot going on, it really takes a lot for it to generate that. So let me show you. Sorry, this one's a little bit more longer than some of the other examples. So another thing that's going on behind the scenes is that this entire level is 2 objects. So it's the opaque stuff, and then, well, it's a couple objects, and then it's the transparent stuff combined into one mesh. So if you use Blender, you can combine a bunch of objects into one, and then, you know, use the same material across all of them. So I'm using this tile set material, and it's just this texture here of like a tile set. Meanwhile, the materials from the bad scene use separate images and materials for each tile. Meanwhile, there are only 2 materials, one opaque, one transparent. I had to separate them to kind of keep the performance up a little bit. So yeah, just these 2 materials, and what I'm doing is, so I'm using a tool that Unity provides in the package manager called Pro Builder to create the models. It's a pretty easy tool to use, and you pull it up, and then you can edit meshes in Unity without having to pull up Blender and stuff like that. It's good for like level geometry and stuff. You know, I can make some pretty easy edits to stuff without too much hassle. So what I'm doing is so you can edit UVs directly in the editor here, and every tile that was combined is using just using different UV spaces. So I'm just moving this around, and you can see it. So like, if I wanted it to be like some other tile, so let me do like, I don't know, something stupid like that. I'm just moving where it's taking the texture from in here, and then you can see the effect right there. So that's for the ground, the walls, and any opaque objects, and it's the same principle for the transparent stuff. It's just using its own shader, and it's just sharing a shader across everything, and it's all combined into one object. So it's super optimal. Now, for the trees, I made a change. So if anybody is doing like a low poly, like kind of just color based game, this is a better option than creating separate materials for every color on a model, or across different models, different colors. You can put this material or this shader on any object, and then all objects in your game share the same material, so everything that is drawn in your game can be batched together at once, and it really makes the performance way better. So what this is it's a vertex color shader, super simple. It has no properties on it. You can't change anything in the material, but what you do is either in Blender or Maya or ProBuilder or whatever 3D suite you're using, instead of setting colors in the material and making a bunch of materials and all that stuff, what you're doing is you are setting the vertex colors in your model. And this shader will let you use the vertex color as a visible element in your model. So I have here, I can do in ProBuilder itself, pull up the palette, and then I can change the color to anything I want. I want to change it to blue, and it changes it. And all of the models that use the same material will all share the same batch, and they'll all be generated as if it was one object. And you'll see that really low draw call count, like you saw, like 20 or 30, like you saw earlier. One cool thing is in ProBuilder, you can paint on the model. So if I wanted to paint it like this really gnarly looking green, I can paint it. If I wanted to paint it red, I can paint the individual vertex colors. If I wanted to paint these like a really gnarly blue, and you can get that gradient. It's an option. You can also do those in your modeling program if you choose to. But it's all really optimized, and instead of this being treated as a separate model, it's the same as any other one that uses so all these trees are the same. You can see, like, other than some so there's the tree right there. So other than, let me disable a tree. So you might see some drops in, you might see some drops in batches. So I disabled that tree and the batches didn't change. I can disable all these trees and the batches generally don't change. Sometimes the shadow caster will make the draw calls drop, but as I keep dropping these until I get down to like 1, that's when they all drop. But it's like you see like a linear increase rather than it being completely unpredictable. So all these are treated, so after the second one, all these are treated the same for the most part. Yeah, it's also the same with that cylinder, so I wanted to illustrate that really quick, is that this cylinder is treated the same as the trees. So it's actually, I believe the reason that it's changing the batches is because it's overlapping with a transparent object, so it has to draw it twice. It's an unfortunate reality, but it's not treated any different than a lot of these other trees are. So it's pretty low cost for something like, having a bunch of different objects share the same material.
Real quick, before you get away from this demo, how did you go about combining the other objects in the scene? What did you use?
ProBuilder. So ProBuilder has the ability to combine objects. So let me pull up the bad scene. So I've got these objects, and then I just do merge objects. If you've got the cool thing is if you've got a model that you've imported into Unity, ProBuilder has this option called ProBuilder Eyes, and it takes a mesh or a model that you've imported into Unity and lets you edit it with ProBuilder. Then you can merge objects using that. It's almost too smart when it comes to like different materials, it won't merge the materials together, so you have to do that yourself. But there are also other options for that. Yeah, so back to... That was a long demo. Sorry about that. What did we learn? How to fix choppiness. Reduce the amount of materials in your scene to a minimum. So try to get them down as low as you can. I had 3. This is about as low as I could probably get it lower if I didn't use transparent fences, if I wanted to. Combine textures or sprites into one atlas. I will actually go over something in the 2D example how to do that. Did you have a question?
No.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Yeah. So in the 2D example, I will go over how to create an atlas and how to combine textures together. Reduce the complexity of your shaders. Consider using legacy diffuse shader instead of the standard one. The standard shader is pretty optimized. It's not bad, but sometimes, especially for like mobile devices, you might just need to switch to diffuse. Reduce the amount of pixel or point lights in your scene, spotlights, anything like that. Turn off shadows for those. I know like a lot of people probably want to keep the shadows because they look really nice, but they are harsh on performance. Try not to have more than 1 or 2 showing at one time. Or if at least like in the distance, turn off shadows for objects you wouldn't really notice shadows. It's like too far away for you to notice shadows on it anyway. If possible, only have 1 directional light cast shadows in your scene. Directional lights are really optimized for shadow casting. There's lots of benefits to using it. I didn't go over overdraw, but I'll go over it in the 2D example. Reduce overlapping transparencies and overdraw. So with the cylinder, you saw some of that. The cylinder had a few extra draw calls because it was behind a transparent object, and there's just not a whole lot you can do other than to reduce that. And then if you have to use point or pixel lights or whatever, and your target device can handle it, use deferred rendering. I didn't go over that, but essentially it's an option in Unity to... there's a whole bunch of stuff when it comes to deferred rendering, but the main benefit of it is that it can handle more pixel lights at once. This device unfortunately can't support it, so a lot of integrated graphics can't support it, but it makes it so that rather than having... It's kind of weird to explain. Essentially just think of it as it saves draw calls for each like pixel light touching an object. So rather than drawing each light separate with its own pass and all that stuff, it does all the lights as one pass and passes it on, and it saves a bunch of draw calls. But unfortunately it'll cut out a large portion of your lower end devices, and should be offered in the options menu rather than as the default. It's not possible on most mobile devices. I know that the Kindle Fire won't support it. Newer iPads support it, but I would generally try to avoid it because it's like, yeah, you're going to end up not having it on the lower end, and then you have to optimize for 2 different rendering types. So I think that's everything there. So yeah, just think of deferred rendering as you can use more lights and the performance is more predictable, but you cut out lower end devices. 2D performance, so I didn't put the demo time thing. So unfortunately with, well maybe fortunately, with the target device, it doesn't really lag on this demo, so I'm just going to show it in the editor. It's a static scene. But I wanted to go over some ways to improve 2D performance. It's really hard to lag a 2D game unless you have a ton of assets. I was trying and I couldn't do it. So let me show the 2D demo. So I've got same deal, 2 versions of the same scene. I've got super simple setup. You know, this might be a typical platforming game. So like I was going over before, you want to keep your draw calls down or your batches together. So we only have 22 batches, which is the I guess worst I could do. It's like the most I could throw at it until it, you know, the draw call count was pretty sizable. In some games it might get pretty bad. You know, you might see hundreds of draw calls. You can see it in a lot of probably bigger indie games. But yeah, super simple scene. This is all that's going on with it. So I've got some tile maps, which is built into Unity. If you don't use them, you know, I would definitely suggest looking into them. So super simple scene, just some characters. I have a character as a separate object. I got this enemy, whatever. So let me show. So that was 22 draw calls, I believe. Here's the same exact scene, visually identical, but now it's 3 draw calls rather than 22. So how do we achieve this? So like I went over, it's the same principles as the 3D stuff, just slightly different because we're not dealing with a lot of materials. We're dealing with sprites, which is just another built-in type of graphic in Unity. So yeah, same exact scene, identical everything. So I've got 2 versions. Let me pull that up really quick. Here. Can everybody see that? Everybody good? Cool. So I've got the bad version, where let me go into 2D sprites. Bad. Here we go. So each of these is like, they're in both good and bad. The objects are their own, like all the sprites are their own file. So I told you guys not to do that before, right? Like to use packed atlas textures, right? So the difference between this set of tiles and this set of tiles is that this set of tiles are atlased. They're atlased using Unity's built-in atlasing tool. A lot of people use a third-party tool called Texture Packer or some alternative to it. Unity has its own built-in variant of it. It's really nice, super easy to use. You need to go to Edit, Project Settings, Editor, and enable it in here. So Sprite Packer mode, always enabled. Once you enable it, you can right-click in your project somewhere and go to Sprite Atlas. You can create a Sprite Atlas. I'm not going to do that because I've already created some. So all of the sprites that I had between the 2 scenes are in the Sprite Atlas. So it's like 200 something. Crazy amount. I have the texture size set to 2048, and then if you just hit pack preview, you can see what the texture looks like right there. This is all of the sprites combined into one atlas. Now anytime, and after this, I don't have to think about it again. I don't have to do anything special to cut it up into pieces and spread it out, you know, do whatever. It's just go and drag the sprite in and, you know, put it where I need it, and I don't have to think about it. It's done all for me in the background. When I add new sprites to the game, I just add them to this list here. So all of the environment assets are in this, or all the environment assets are in this atlas, while all the characters, only 2 of them, are in this atlas. So anytime any of these sprites exist in the camera's view, they're drawn as one object behind the scenes. So it just uses one batch, and it's super optimized. You can manipulate it as you would a texture. You can change the filtering to point, whatever you want, add padding, allow rotation. A lot of the stuff that you can do in Texture Packer, you can do in here. And any changes made to a sprite are automatically updated. So it's super convenient, easy to use. I'm using the tile mapper, which is a new feature as of I think last year in Unity. lets you paint tiles in your scene like you would in like what's that program, Tiled, if you've used that. So I can just paint on a tile map. I'm gonna do my optimized one. I'm just gonna paint a bunch of doors somewhere. You just paint whatever you want. Yeah. What else? Oh, so I'm gonna go over Overdraw really quick. So another optimization thing that you should keep an eye on is Overdraw. If you've got a bunch of transparent objects, or if you've got two objects overlapping each other, and one object is either partially or completely covered by another one, that object's still being rendered, and it's a waste of graphics time. You can look at what your overdraw looks like in your scene by going up in your scene view, clicking on that shaded, and setting it to overdraw. So you'll start to see this is what the scene looks like when you're, like what objects are overlapping. Their view is, like two objects are being rendered in front of each other. So bear with me for a second. This is the background, this is the background layer. There's also a layer behind that of those towers. Those are going all the way down. Then we've got what looks like, I think that's the tree. I think that's the zombie. These are the flowers here, and there's just all this overlap. These are the flags that are coming down, the banners or whatever. I think this is another tree, and that's the character. So you see there's overdraw, and you can't see the pixels for this tower. You can't see these. It's just wasted effort for the graphics card to draw. For 2D, it's not so bad, but if you're doing a 3D game, and I can show you back at the 3D view, overdraw still exists there. It's all the same concepts in 2D and 3D. You can see overdraw. So there's all these wasted pixels that are still being considered for rendering. It might not do anything with them, but it's still having to do calculations, checking whether or not it should render those pixels. And sometimes it renders them anyway. So try it, especially in really complex 2D games, I tried to, make this a decent example of overdraw. I had the zombie be larger than, if it was the size of this entire screen like this, that's what the zombie looked like. Your game is officially wasting that much time rendering all these pixels, and it doesn't need to do that. So try to keep those things managed. And if you've got stuff like this background, this very, very background element, where you got these towers that are stretching all the way down, maybe consider erasing the pixels you can't see. And then there's no overdraw. You'll see it looks nice and clean now. The brighter it looks, the more overdraw there is. So that's what you should take away from that. Maybe in, so this is the level. Maybe erase these pixels here. And now there's no more overdraw. And hopefully, if everything went according to plan, yep, looks identical. Doesn't look any different. And you saved some rendering time. So, let's do that. Yeah, so, I guess we learned a lot of the same things that we did in the 3D example. Combine textures, combine any materials you're using, prevent overdraw. Bit of a bonus round. What's up?
So, why did you keep your characters and your other tiles in separate atlases?
Mostly, so if you're doing a lot of animations and stuff, the atlases can become really big. So if I had the tiles in the same atlas as the characters, and say I had a full run cycle in, I can actually show you an example really quick. If I had a full run cycle in the same atlas as the tiles, okay, I might get some benefit from them being atlas together, but if the character's too big and the atlas overflows, it'll create a second atlas of tiles, and then you lose the benefit of having those tiles as one draw call. So behind the scenes, it'll generate more atlases and tie them together, but still it's like you'll lose that benefit of them being batched. So let me show you what that looks like. So I got these tiles, right? I was saying like the max texture size, you can change that. That doesn't change the size of the image. It changes how many tile or how many sprites can fit in that atlas. So if I set the 1024 and hit pack preview, change the whole thing first of all. So now it's got to generate the whole thing. We have to wait here. But so now all these trees are on their own atlas, even though they're using the same atlas asset. And then now I've got 3 separate textures. And now, like for example, this image here and one of these random trees will be separate batches. They won't be batched together anymore. And now I've got like a random assortment of these things. I mean, you can get down really low, like 64. I don't want to do that, but you want everything to be on one. And sometimes that means making the call to put them on separate atlases like that. So it also allows you to, so if I were to have 10 different worlds in my game, right? And I have 10 different tile sets, and all the tiles existed on one tile set asset, all the tiles for a level that's not being played right now are being loaded. And that takes up extra memory, takes extra loading time, all that stuff. So like if I got my character and the character's not using the grass world tile set, it's still loading the grass world tiles if it's all in one. So you got to kind of make a call where you want those savings to be. So.
And then, so what were you saying the difference was with the bad version? Like, you're saying the bad version didn't use the tile set?
It didn't use the atlasing. It was all separate sprites.
But doesn't the atlasing occur automatically once you set up that?
I had as separate. Okay, so I have 2 folders in here. I've got these, which aren't being atlased. These are set to not atlas.
Oh.
But by default, Unity doesn't atlas things. So these are as if I just dumped a bunch of tiles into my game and just like, yeah, I'll put them anywhere. Like, I don't care. There is some work to do. You have to go in, right-click, create sprite atlas, and then drag them into this list, you know, pack preview. And then, yeah, you have to actually do some work. It's not like a thing you get out of the box, but it's so worth the time. I mean, you saw it, it's down to 3 draw calls.
Yeah.
Same exact thing. So
Unity doesn't have anything to notice if you have the same image in your project multiple times?
I think sprites will batch if they're the same. But that scene had a bunch of different images in it, so.
If you duplicate an image, it's 2 separate sprites.
Yeah.
But if you duplicate it in the project, not if you duplicate the game object. If it's
Right,
2 separate
right.
game objects with the same image, yeah.
That's shared, but like
Right. No, I
on
was
the
gonna
phone
say-
objects, it's
Yeah.
not smart enough to say these pixels are exactly the same.
Yeah. So, yeah, it's kind of the same principles as the 3D stuff. So, we're near the end. I'm going to go over a few extra little bonus things, and then we're good to go. So, extra things to remember. If you're working on iOS specifically, you have to set the target frame rate to be 60 because out of the box, it's locked to 30. I have no clue why. It's probably a battery saving effort on Unity's part. But once you put this line of code anywhere that runs in your game in a scene in the start function of your game will run 60 frames per second on iOS, and it feels really good.
Some Android phones do that too.
Okay.
My Google Pixel 2 was locked at 30.
Okay. Yeah, if you put that in there,
Yeah,
it'll fix it. So worth it because having a touch screen react that's also another thing I didn't really go over, is that the higher the frame rate is, the more immediate the reaction the game has to your touches or to your input. So it feels really good when you're touching a screen it's running 60 frames a second, because it feels immediate when you touch it. So make sure your game, I think I went over a little bit of this, but make sure your game runs an extra 10 to 20 frames over your target frame rate. So you would have to turn vertical sync off to gauge that. It'll add more padding. So if you are running at 90 frames per second but only showing 60 frames because vertical sync is on, and you hit a 10 frame lag spike, you won't feel it. Some new stuff from Unity, specifically the lightweight render pipeline. So for all the people doing graphics and art and stuff, this is a really cool thing from Unity. So I was saying before with deferred rendering that the lighting is more optimized because you can have more lights in your scene, which then they get batched together and sent to the graphics card all at once, rather than rendering a pass for every light in the scene. This is similar to that, but runs on mobile. If you get a chance, look into this. It's really cool. You'll get some crazy good performance out of your game if you use this. I've played around with it, and I was able to use post-processing effects in a game on this device that would normally not be able to use it. It would just lag. So like post-processing is stuff like motion blur, or like depth of field blur, so you see like the background blur, or color correction. You can do that stuff in your game, but the problem is it takes a lot of performance to do it, and there's like a hard cost to using it. And this lightened up the cost enough for the rest of the game that I could implement post-processing in the game. So in short, more performance. You just have to make some considerations for your game. So in all of the stuff you've seen tonight are available on GitHub. You can look at the code. So it all uses the Unity starter project, and feel free to use that as well. That's on my GitHub. So yeah. So you can contact me in any of these. Any questions? Concerns? Yeah, go. Either one. Go. Hi.
So on the example that you showed with ProBuilder, and
Yeah.
you combined everything.
Yeah.
What's the recommended workflow when it comes to, okay, everything in my whole world is combined to save draw calls?
Sure.
I want to move this door 3 inches to the left.
Yeah.
What do I do there?
So there's a couple things. So ProBuilder does have the option to keep the old models around. Keep all the old objects around, and then you can delete the merged one, re-enable all the old ones, and move it around, and then re-merge it. One thing I would say is that try to avoid moving combining everything in your scene. Another optimization I really didn't go over is what's called occlusion cooling, or the more simpler version is Frustum Cooling. Anything outside the view of the camera is not rendered. The thing is, if you've got a 3D world and all the objects are combined, right? You turn around, all that stuff behind you is still being rendered. So once you've kind of got your draw calls under control, you've got other things to worry about, like Polygon Count. Now, like officially, like you've freed up the bottleneck between your CPU and graphics card, dealing with draw calls, stuff like that. Now you have to deal with all the other stuff that, like, developers since the beginning of time have had to deal with, which is like polygons and pixel shaders and vertex shaders and stuff like that. So those now need to be optimized. So once you get to the point where it's like everything's combined and this is all one draw call, now it's like stuff behind me is being generated. This scene is a massive amount of polygons, and now either you need to then split it up into objects again, or reduce the polygon count. You had a question, Ben?
I was about to clap, actually. I'm sorry.
Oh. Any question? Anybody? Yeah.
So if you have things in a tile map
Yeah.
that are rendered overlapping, is that still one call, or is it a separate call to like apply the transparency?
So if you've got multiple transparent objects, I believe that they are done it like overlapping transparencies. Like if you have two overlapping, that they are done in one pass. I might be wrong on that. They would be done in one pass. So if they are batched together normally, they would still be batched together. The only time with tile maps that you'll deal with overlap is if you have multiple tile maps. So Unity's workflow is like a tile map is like one layer. So like if you add a transparent object to the same tile map as like your wall, it'll delete the wall and then just be transparency and you see into the skybox. And then but then there's like, you know, like say it's a circle or something and then everything in the square around it in the square is transparent. Any more questions? Anybody working on a Unity game that's having performance issues? They run into anything that they didn't know how to solve? Okay. Cool. All right, that's it for me then.
Thank you for doing like 5 game jam for the work in order to put this presentation.
Yeah. It was interesting because so I started working on it like on the actual examples a couple days ago, probably like Friday, I think, and like you'd be surprised how hard it is to come up with like even 2 worst practices, like examples, and then
you don't want to like force it. You know, you want it to be natural.
I tried not to force it where I could. The thing with like the resources unload is like a lot of that happens in the background anyway, so it's like I'm kind of just forcing it to happen earlier. Kind of had to fudge it a little, but you get a faster, nicer demo. So, did we have any questions from the stream?
No. So,
Okay.
so there was somebody who popped in and asked something earlier, but then after the stream cut out, I
It
had to restart.
crashed.
I'm trying to remember what it was.
Okay.
I think I missed something, but I was probably just distracted where maybe you're just switching between good and bad examples. Like the whole 3D scene you made into one mesh.
The pixel art scene
Yeah, the 3D.
with the house in the middle. Yeah. So in the good version, it's 2 meshes.